Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's operational information update on the flooding and landslide situation in BC. For today's briefing, we'll have updates from Minister of Public Safety and Solicitor General Mike Farnworth, Minister of Indigenous Relations and Reconciliation Murray Rankin, Minister of Transportation and Infrastructure Rob Fleming, and Minister of Agriculture, Food and Fisheries Lana Popham. A reminder to media on the line, please press *1 to enter the queue. You will be limited to one question and one follow-up. With that, I'll turn it over to Minister Farnworth.
Good morning, everyone, and I'm honored to be here on the traditional territory of the Lekwungen-speaking people and the Songhees and the Esquimalt First Nations. Environment and Climate Change Canada has forecast a series of storms with more atmospheric rivers predicted to come to British Columbia over the coming week. These storms are coming at a time when we're already grappling with some of the most destructive weather we've ever seen. They are coming as crews work day and night to repair the extensive damage from last week. And while there is still significant flood damage in many places throughout the province, we are making progress on our recovery. But in many ways, we are still in uncharted territory when it comes to these storms. Having several destructive storms in a row is not anywhere near normal. We've had almost a dozen atmospheric rivers since mid-September. The ground is already saturated, which means that even a routine storm for this time of year can cause rivers and streams to rise faster and potentially flood. The ground is wetter, snowmelt is occurring, and some areas are extremely vulnerable due to recent wildfires and droughts. Although we are up to the challenge, we are working through a monumental task. Environment and Climate Change Canada modelers are working hard to try to predict where these storms will strike and how severe they will be. Crews are working around the clock to make critical repairs on Sumas Prairie before the next weather systems come. Through all of this, some people are returning to their homes in Merritt, Princeton, and elsewhere. They're beginning the difficult work of dealing with the debris and the destruction that floodwaters left behind. And yet others remain evacuated, some now for more than a week. In Princeton, Canadian Armed Forces are now on site, with more expected to arrive later today. Conditions are even more challenging for residents along Highway 8 between Merritt and Spence's Bridge. The pictures and videos showing large sections of the highway washed away by the Nicola River are dramatic. Residents along that corridor needed to evacuate quickly, often with just the clothes on their backs. The timeline for their return and return of this route is not yet known. However, in the meantime, the province will be here and will continue to provide the emergency supports that people need. These are complicated and dynamic times. Because of that, we've set up a new Service BC contact center line, where you can get information on things related to floods like emergency supports, disaster financial aid, mental health supports, road conditions and travel, federal supports like employment insurance, agriculture supports, and more information will be added as we continue to move through our response to help British Columbians. The toll-free phone number is 1-833-376-2452. This resource is available from 7:30 a.m. in the morning to 5 p.m., 7 days a week. I know I share with all British Columbians a deep sadness for the loss of life, the destruction, and the upheaval. And yet, there is some good news. Although there is still a lot of work to be done, exceptional people are doing it. Thousands of emergency workers, including government, first responders, construction crews, volunteers, soldiers, and more are working hard to help keep people safe and get communities the supports that they need. As announced yesterday, more help is on the way. The province is partnering with the Canadian Red Cross to provide $2,000 in supports for those who have been evacuated. Donations for flood relief are flowing into the Red Cross, the United Way, BC liquor stores, food banks, and other trusted organizations. Through monumental efforts, roads and railways are starting to reopen and move goods. Supply lines are stabilizing. And thanks to the majority of British Columbians who are adhering to gas rationing in their areas, shopping only for food in the short term, shortages are starting to ease in many areas. Yesterday, I had the opportunity to meet with First Nations leadership along with Minister Rankin. It was an opportunity to hear their concern and seek ways to better align our emergency responses. There are further challenges ahead, but we all have the same goal: to keep the people in this province as safe as we can. First Nations communities have stepped up countless times to care for displaced British Columbians in need, and this storm event is no different. Near Hope, the Squahaluk and Seabird Island First Nation took in stranded motorists after the Highway 7 mudslides, many of whom had been sleeping in their cars. The Lillooet Friendship Centre provided meals and a warm place to stay for dozens more following the Highway 99 slides. The Sequoialuks First Nation opened their gym to house stranded travelers. And I want to take this opportunity to thank all in the communities that have stepped up to help those in need. It's truly a remarkable side of British Columbians. Together, we will see the other side of these storms. But for now, we are still a long way from being out of danger. We must remain vigilant, especially as these weather systems come back again. We need to be prepared. Do what you can to storm-proof your properties. Be sure to regularly check for updates, warnings, and alerts from local and First Nation authorities. If you're in a flood-prone area, be prepared to evacuate when to ask to, and avoid any unnecessary travel. Stay off restricted roadways. Adhere to gas rationing rules. Buy only what you need in the short term. Keep emergency supplies in your vehicles, such as food, water, warm clothes, and a blanket, just in case. And know this: we are all in this together. We're all going to work hard to build back better, and we will be building back better, so that we can better withstand the extreme weather events that are part of the future. And through this, I know British Columbians will continue to rise to these challenges by being calm, compassionate, generous, kind, reasoned, and resilient. That's how we've got through the challenges of the last 20 months, whether it's been COVID, whether it's been fires, whether it's been floods. And we're going to continue doing it. With that, I'd now like to turn it over to Minister Rankin. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Farnworth. I'd like to start by acknowledging that we're here today in Lekwungen-speaking territory, the territory currently of the Esquimalt and Songhees nations. As we all know, I think Indigenous communities and First Nations have been heavily impacted by recent flooding and landslides. Many First Nations are now facing the impact of these events, including being displaced from their homes, concerns about food security and harvesting, difficulties practicing ceremony and culture, and being separated from family and loved ones. And the floods have only added to the trauma of the last year. Minister Farnworth talked about that. Wildfires, COVID-19, in addition the opioid crisis and the residential school findings, the heat dome, and of course the continuing impacts of climate change. In the last few days, I've been able to speak with many chiefs in the Mid-Island, in Lytton, and Agassiz, Merritt, and Hope, and other impacted nations in the interior. Chiefs and members of Indigenous communities have shown enormous resilience and great leadership during this difficult period. For example, the new fuel restrictions that Minister Farnworth talked about were implemented last week, and the chiefs of the Nechalneth and chair of the Tribal Council were instrumental in a response to work with my ministry to ensure that there was unrestricted access for essential vehicles in remote Indigenous communities. The work to ensure First Nations can access available supports is happening across the government. EMBC, with the help from CN Rail, organized delivery of over 3,000 pounds of food to several impacted First Nations. We're also helping move health authority personnel and medications to outlying areas so that we can continue to support families and individuals who need assistance. In partnership, the First Nations Emergency Services Society, the First Nation Health Authority, Indigenous Services Canada, our government has assembled multi-agency teams that will better support First Nation communities with little or no access. We're calling these Integrated Indigenous Response and Recovery Deployment Teams. Staff from the First Nations Emergency Services Society, the First Nation Health Authority, Indigenous Services Canada, and Emergency Management BC will all be part of these teams. Yesterday, I was on a call with First Nation leaders and Minister Farnworth. We heard from impacted communities. We heard their concerns as to how we could improve our response. And I heard we have more work to do. We must improve our communications with First Nation communities in advance of and during emergencies. We need to streamline our processes to help people access supports more easily. And we can work to ensure that the supports provided to First Nation communities are meeting the needs identified by the communities themselves. I've also heard many inspiring stories of First Nation peoples helping their neighboring communities. It's this spirit of cooperation that will see us through these very difficult times. And it's an incredibly stressful time for everyone. And I've heard from chiefs of impacted nations and members of the First Nations Leadership Council how people are being faced with the compounding impacts of multiple crises, as well as, in some cases, systemic racism within the emergency social services system. First Nations have suggested that we must work to increase understanding and training among emergency social services staff and volunteers, so we have the tools to identify racism and address incidents if and when they arise. During the 2021 wildfire event, EMBC hired an Indigenous ESS training specialist. This position is responsible for integrating culturally safe practices into emergency support services. EMBC's Emergency Support Services team has linked to the First Nation Health Authority and into reception centers in Kamloops and Abbotsford to provide cultural supports for evacuees. This includes offering space for culturally significant practices such as smudging that will be provided by 2 local knowledge keepers. These are just our first steps. This crisis and the events of the last year have shown how critical it is for all levels of government to work together in an emergency. And weather experts are saying that we'll see more rain in the coming week. In order to prepare First Nation communities, we are engaging with impacted nations. We're reaching out to determine current and future needs and readying the integrated Indigenous response and recovery deployment teams that I mentioned earlier. I want to end by thanking the First Nation leaders throughout British Columbia for their courage, their compassion, and their patience as we all work together to get through this crisis. I'd also like to thank the First Nation Emergency Services Society, the First Nation Health Authority, and Indigenous Services Canada for their leadership and work as well. Thank you. Minister Fleming.
Thank you, Minister Rankin, and good afternoon. I want to begin the Ministry of Transportation and Infrastructure's update today by talking about Highway 1 through the Fraser Valley. We're pleased to report that some critical temporary repairs are now completed and that water levels continue to recede. Today, our crews are on the flood-affected portion of Highway 1, clearing debris off the road. We're looking to have this road open at some point tomorrow. So Highway 1 tomorrow is what we are projecting as the estimated opening time through the Fraser Valley and to connect with the rest of Highway 1. We know that people in this region need to travel around. This will provide significant relief, and we will keep people updated on that estimated time of opening. While we get traffic moving again on Highway 1, I do want to talk about the travel restriction orders that came into effect at 8 p.m. last night on Highway 7 from the area west of Agassiz to Mission. This had to take place. This was necessary because the trucks and supply chains we sought to reactivate were hopelessly congested on Highway 7, and this was not a decision that was taken lightly, but we needed to unblock that corridor so that goods could begin to move and reactivate supply chains that all British Columbians depend on. I am pleased to say that the restrictions are working. As of this morning, essential traffic was able to move significantly faster than at the same time yesterday. Travel is still taking longer than usual, but these short-term restrictions are helping us get essential goods and services moving out of the Lower Mainland to communities around BC. I understand that these restrictions are very challenging for some people, and I want to thank everybody who lives in that area for doing their part. So although we have some potential good news for Highway 1 tomorrow, Highway 7 for the time being will continue to have restrictions with a focus on essential vehicle travel. And until we have a full understanding of how Highway 1 will operate, and as we monitor upcoming weather events, we will continue to have those restrictions in place on the number 7. Last week, the federal government worked with the United States to implement measures to help fast-track truckers who don't typically travel to the U.S., and the United States responded, and they temporarily relaxed some of its permitting requirements so that those truckers could drive into the Washington state and re-enter Canada beyond the flood impact area. And I'm pleased to say that the United States has added more exemptions to that list as of today. This allows even more essential goods and products to move on alternate routes through the U.S., through highways in northern Washington to reconnect to the rest of our province. So there's more positive news for our supply chains as well. Last night, CP Rail restarted its operations. As of today, CN Rail is expecting to have its trains operational by tomorrow. That is going to be a huge help for British Columbia and all Canadians. And I want to express my sincere thanks to my federal counterpart, Minister Omar Al-Gabra, for his continued support for British Columbia. I also want to talk about Indigenous, working with Indigenous communities through our ministry. Constructive partnerships are what we've talked about in this time of crisis over the last number of updates, recovering transportation corridors, recovering trade routes. I've talked about our partnership with the federal government, with private sector companies, but there's also been a huge impact on Indigenous communities where we've had highway closures. And my ministry is working very closely with the Forest Ministry to make sure that there's temporary access restored for Indigenous communities that have had road access cut off after the flood event. And we continue to work in collaboration with Indigenous communities on the repair work that is needed. We've set up regular calls in my ministry with Indigenous leadership to provide real-time updates on each site as we repair and work toward reopening our highways. We've hired Indigenous companies to deliver on archaeological services, for example, on Highway 1 through the Fraser Canyon. We'll continue to look for these consulting services from communities as we repair our infrastructure. Some of the Indigenous communities that were not directly impacted by the floods have also reached out to our ministry as well, and we are and they reached out to offer their equipment and resources to help in the province-wide response, and we thank those Indigenous communities and companies for that support. We appreciate the spirit of collaboration and partnership with Indigenous communities, and we look forward to continuing to work together in these extraordinary times. I do want to share a couple of stories that emerged now that we have updated on some of the highway reopenings. And they are inspirational ones. As everyone knows, last Monday evening, when the storms had, by that Monday, when the storms had damaged so much infrastructure, there were several hundred truck drivers essentially trapped throughout the southern interior part of the province. And the response was unbelievable. The thought that communities had for truck drivers who were far from home and facing uncertainty ahead of them. The generosity, the caring that Hope residents showed is of course a thing of legend now. But this was taking place in other communities as well. In Golden, the local Gurdwara Sabib broadcast an invitation to truck drivers in the area to access shelter and to have food delivered to them. In Kamloops, the local Sikh community was serving up to 200 meals a day to stranded truckers. These are the things, the moments where British Columbians came together, fed one another, cared for one another, and sheltered one another. In our own ministry, we have a bit of a hero that I want to give a shout out to today, who helped people who were trapped on Highway 7, Tracy Winnick. She displayed incredible leadership in a very difficult situation. She knew what to do. She walked the line of cars, talked to drivers. She shared her food and water because she was prepared for any circumstance. And she was helping to update stranded travelers with information that she could garner. She communicated with the maintenance contractor, with emergency responders. She helped keep people safe and calm. And she insisted that she be the last person who was flown out and evacuated from that stretch of highway. So we have people like Tracy to thank in situations that happen across the province. Let me just say in closing, a word of thanks to all those who've gotten us to where we are today, to be able to update and reopen infrastructure, the responders who showed up, the people who welcomed and cared for people who were stranded in not their own community, the crews who put in incredibly long hours repairing our roads and continue to do so. We have essential goods and services moving in the province today, and it's because thousands of British Columbians with skills and ability and their first instinct being to help stepped up and did exactly that. Thank you. And I'll now ask Minister Popham to come.
Good afternoon. I'm happy to be here today to give an update from the agriculture sector in BC. Yesterday, I went out with MLA Pam Alexis and MLA Ian Payton for a flyover the valley. We were able to fly over Abbotsford and up into Chilliwack. We had hoped to get up into the Merritt area, but the weather was not our friend yesterday, so we'll be going there in the coming days. We also were able to get onto the ground and have a meeting with I'll wait for that to finish. With Mayor Braun of Abbotsford, who I just have to say, I just can't thank him for his tireless work. He's had no sleep. A really amazing community leader. We were able to meet with him. We looked at maps of the restoration of some of the minor roadways that are going through that area and how they're coming back online. The conversations that we were able to have at one cross checkpoint with farmers was really, really important. We had about 30 farmers join us on Highway 1 off to the side. And I have to tell you that there was a lot of shared tears and a lot of hugs. These folks are going through a lot, and they made time out of their really incredibly busy, disrupted lives to come and tell us face to face the stories that they have. And so we know that it's definitely our livestock sector that's been affected, but many blueberry farmers, vegetable farmers also came out, greenhouse sector came out to tell us many of them are displaced out of their own homes, and it's very tough times. But there's, within those very difficult stories, there's also some pretty amazing stories that are continuing to emerge. Holger Schwischenberg, the chair of the BC Dairy Association, was able to tell us about a dairy farm in the valley. Dairy farmers Carl and Rudy Meyer, who have a dairy with 180 dairy cows. The waters came up so fast on Monday, they couldn't get their livestock out. And so all 180 dairy cows were up to their necks in water. And those brothers went in and fed those cows hay for 2 days while those cows were submerged in that water. And I have to say that on Wednesday, the waters receded. The cows are fine and they're back online and they're milking those cows. So that, huge kudos to Carl and Rudy. Thank you for being amazing local heroes. That was an amazing story to hear. The conversations continue with the federal government. We are developing an agri-recovery program right now to support our producers. The details of that will be coming out in the coming days. Where these conversations that we're having on the ground are really important, so we capture all of the needs that are out there in the agriculture community. Farmers are really concerned right now about the removal of deceased animals. We do have a location in Abbotsford where people are taking calls. There's a number of people where people can call to have animals removed. We know that there's a lot of grief that farmers are feeling around this issue. I went and spoke with the folks that are taking those phone calls, and their job is tough too, so I want to thank them. They're receiving calls from, it's just the issue is very sad, and so, but farmers just know that there's people on the other end of those phones that understand how difficult this is for you, and they're trying to get this process moving as fast as possible. We're working with local governments on where to take those deceased animals right now. And so we are seeing movement there, but the best thing you can do, especially if you're in the poultry industry, hog industry, dairy industry, get a hold of your associations. There's a very close working relationship that they have with our ministry right now. We've made about 1,200 connections directly since last Monday, and a lot of that also includes outreach to Indigenous communities. We've had conversations with, we have a Ministers Indigenous Advisory Council on Agriculture and Food, and so roundtable with them yesterday, the First Nations Agricultural Association of BC, Seabird Island First Nation, Lac-Skiltsap Village Government, Kanakabar First Nation, Coldwater Indian Band, Lower Nicola First Nation, and Linton First Nation. And we're going to be continuing to reach out with these important partners and talk to them about their experiences and perspectives as we look to making our food system as resilient and sustainable as we can. Our food supply chain continues to be stable, so I want to reassure British Columbians that there are truckloads of food that continue to pour into British Columbia, and those shelves are being stocked. We believe that at this point we're back operating at about 80% of normal with milk deliveries, and so I know there's been a bit of a conversation out there about some smaller places not having milk on the shelves, but that's being resolved. And so I want to say just in closing that there's good news stories that are emerging, and we see a lot of these local heroes showing up, but that really doesn't override the grief that we know the communities are feeling. But I think what it does is it allows us to feel hopeful for better days. Thank you.
A reminder to media on the line, please press *1 to enter the queue. You'll be limited to one question and one follow-up. Our first question today comes from Joel Ballard, CBC.
Hello, thank you for taking our call. So, Minister Farnworth, this question's actually for you. In 2003 and 2004, the previous Liberal government offloaded responsibilities for flood hazard land use management to municipalities. And experts have said that BC's model of flood and dike management makes it hard to plan regionally for the future. Just last May, there was a report from the Fraser Basin Council that concluded that the current model for flood risk governance in BC is broken. Is this something the government is currently reviewing?
I'll just wait till the bells finish. Yeah, no, thank you for that question. It is absolutely something that we are reviewing. Since 2017, a number of actions have taken place in terms of around emergency preparedness, and now that obviously involves dikes and flooding. One, as I've outlined before, is us signing up to the Sendai framework, the first province to do so, along with the federal government, and an overhaul underway in terms of the Emergency Program Act, the first significant overhaul since 1993. We are currently working on a BC flood strategy. That work is underway, and that is also going to be part and parcel of the new legislation that we're looking at for 2022. Since 2017, we have invested more than $105 million in improving our dikes, for example, and improving flood mapping. But obviously a lot more needs to be done. But that work has been underway and is going to continue being underway and is very much a priority.
Joel, do you have a follow-up?
Yes, I do. So Whistler is opening up tomorrow, which will likely mean an influx of visitors, tourists heading from the Lower Mainland and beyond. Is there any concern as to what this could mean, both in terms of fuel and food supplies in the Sea to Sky region, but also given that heavy rain is expected, what would your advice be to travelers who are heading up there?
Right now, people should avoid all unnecessary travel. People have been abiding by the 30-liter rule, and we do have good fuel supplies. We need to ensure that our supply chains are kept open. People need to pay attention to the weather to drive BC, and if you don't have to travel, don't travel.
Next question, we go to Andrea Demir, Similkameen Spotlight.
Hello. This question is for Minister Farnworth, and thank you for taking my question. The town of Princeton is under a state of emergency and has applied for funding to repair water lines destroyed by the flood of the Tulameen River. We've been told that the funding of an emergency water line to provide water to the north half of town is delayed because it is being treated as recovery funding and not an emergency. Why is that? Presently, water is being conducted from one side of town to the other by a string of fire hoses.
What I can tell you is that there is not a delay, that disaster funding is in place. The ability to repair damaged infrastructure, municipalities are able to do that. There may be issues in terms of water quality. I know that there is a boil water advisory, but in terms of repairs to infrastructure, there's not a delay in waiting for approval for funding. The DFA funding the area has already been declared, and work can start on repairing damaged infrastructure.
Andrea, do you have a follow-up?
I do. There is a boil water advisory in some areas of town, but most of the town is under just a contamination order with not to consume. This isn't about quality of water. It's about actually getting water from our reservoir to people who need it. And this is the information I've received from the municipality. So I'm wondering if there's a disconnect.
No, what I can tell you is that EMBC and ministries across government have been in communication with the town of Princeton. They have been asking for a number of services. So initially they asked for traffic control. That's in place. They have asked for the military to assist. As I said in my remarks, the military is there. Some are already on the ground. More are arriving today to assist with the cleanup. They are also assisting in terms of the assessment of the damage and what needs to be put in place. Fortis has restored power to over 1,000 homes that were without natural gas supply. We're aware of the issue around water. They have been bringing in, ever since the disaster, water and other supplies. And in terms of repairing infrastructure, there is not a need for a delay.
Next question goes to Penny Daflos, CTV.
Hi there. Thank you very much for taking my question. I guess the first one is just based on the minister and your comments around Whistler there. Like, do you want people to cancel hotel reservations if they've made them already? I mean, people have booked, ski passes and all sorts of things that may be non-refundable. Is that your expectation at this point, that this non-essential travel, you want people to, pull out of all sorts of activities that they planned?
Thank you. I think the gas restrictions apply to everybody in the Lower Mainland, Vancouver Island, Sunshine Coast, Gulf Islands. The other parts of the province, they do not, because there's fuel supply there. The order is in place until December 1st. Of course, the province will update if that restriction can come off sooner. There is supply en route from multiple sources to BC. Canadian fuel retailers is reporting that after a robust weekend of gasoline purchases, things have got back to what they normally are right now. That's the observation that was shared with me. The part of Highway 99 where there are actual travel restrictions that we're concerned about is past beyond Pemberton and where the slide activity happened and tragically claimed lives. So we're not worried from a congestion point of view about the Lower Mainland connecting to communities like Squamish and Whistler, but we will be advising that only essential travel is possible in the area north of Pemberton.
Penny, do you have a follow-up?
I do, yeah, and it's just in relation to Highway 8. So I don't know which minister wants to address this because it's a bit of a two-parter. I mean, on the one hand, we're hearing that people are at the breaking point there. They're not getting the mental health supports that they need. These are communities that have been, ravaged by wildfires in the summer and drought, and now they've been forced from their homes, some of which have been swept away. So I want to know whether you're going to send mental health supports to the area because that's what they're pleading for right now. They say there's nothing like that. And then I also want to know, when it comes to Highway 8, I mean, what is the timeline? Because that seems to be one of the most destroyed or shattered roads in the province right now, and these people just want to know, are they going to be out for weeks or months, or could it be even longer? They're just looking for some answers.
Okay, so I'll deal with the first part, and then Minister Fleming will deal with the second part. So we spoke yesterday, both Minister Rankin and I, with affected First Nations, and the Highway 8 issue came up in the communities along there. We are doing everything we can to ensure that emergency support services are there. We are working with the First Nations Health Authority and FINESS, the Emergency Social Services for First Nations, to ensure that those supports and the resources that they need are available to them. We've also been working in terms of identifying additional routes, such as forest roads, for them to be able to access critical areas in their communities. In terms of the Highway 8 itself, I'll turn that over to Minister Fleming.
And we'll actually send it to a technical expert in the interior. Paula Cousins, please go ahead.
Thank you. We have a team of project managers, engineers, and construction experts that are gathering this week and working closely with local Indigenous and community leaders to start looking at options for Highway 8. The damage is extensive, but our first priority is to look at wherever we can feasibly gain short-term and temporary access, and we hope to have an update for communities next week on where and if we can do that and when.
Thank you, Paula. Next question, Richard Zussman, Global News.
This is a question for Minister Rankin. The Shakin First Nation says that EMBC didn't give them proper food or accommodations for the first couple of days they were evacuated, on top of concerns now that they've received no guidance on how to move forward accessing their territory or their homes. Is this community one of the ones that you've been speaking to over the last few days, and what do you say to them about their concerns?
Thank you very much, Richard. I've spoken with, I think, a couple of dozen now communities that are affected, mostly chiefs in those communities, and I've heard of a number of different accounts, as you can imagine, depending on the circumstances of each one. It's true that there have been difficulties in some places, particularly where access is cut off, roadways have been obviously bridges are down, and it's very difficult to get certain parts of the Indigenous community affected. I think what we are talking about now in improving our delivery of those services is to work with all of the agencies that I mentioned, First Nation Emergency Services Society, the First Nation Health Authority, the Federal Indigenous Services Canada, and EMBC to come together in a sense to create a rapid response team. We're calling it the Integrated Indigenous Response and Recovery Deployment Team. So we can deal with these issues. So for example, if there's a problem with food, we can have people helicoptered in immediately. If there's a stress and need for just some kind of rapid response to a circumstance that no one really knows about until you get there, we'll have people on the ground more rapidly than we would before. So I think the circumstances in each community are different. I don't know the specifics of that particular issue that you've raised.
Richard, do you have a follow-up?
Yeah, just to provide clarity, Minister, it's the Shakin Indian Band in the Nicola Valley, so I don't know if that gives any more clarity. And to Minister Fleming about the news of Highway 1 reopening, could that be impacted by the next weather wave that's coming through here? And what sort of precautions are you giving people as they prepare for the Highway 1 reopening?
I'll let Minister Fleming speak to that. I have spoken with leaders in the upper and lower Nicola Valley area, and of course I know they were particularly lower Nicola, very, very affected. And so we're going to continue that dialogue. But on the specifics of the second part of your question, I'll turn it over to Minister Fleming.
So yes, the update is that we can expect Highway 1 to reopen fully through the Fraser Valley tomorrow. We'll continue to update on the progress removing debris and getting and inspecting the condition of the highway where waters have receded. And of course, we will be monitoring it, and it will be contingent on the weather. The ground is, as Minister Farnworth has stated, saturated. It is in the Sumas Prairie area, this stretch of the highway. So managing water levels, watching precipitation. We will advise motorists, as always, through Drive BC on what the conditions of Highway 1 and other areas of concern are like. But we'll update the public tomorrow on how the work is going today on Highway 1 and whether we can reopen. But that's the projection as of this moment.
Next question, we go to Jody Greenwald, Fraser Valley Current.
Yes, thank you. Just to clarify, it's Jyoti Graywall. I tried to have that correction made earlier, but I guess it didn't stick. So I just wanted to ask, as the forecast calls for more rain, has the province made any changes to avoid a repeat of last week where commuters had little to no notice before the highway closed and or highway closures? And specifically, what changes have been made, if any?
We have road maintenance contractors and crew and about 250 pieces of heavy equipment that remain mobilized for highways. We're concerned that we may have to do preemptive closures like we did on Highway 3. We'll be making that call. That was a human decision based on observation. So those are the types of preparations that we're taking for the weather events that we can anticipate in the next 10 days.
Thank you, Jyoti. Appreciate it. Do you have a follow-up?
Yes. So I see that the ministry is making use of temporary bridges to reestablish some of the highway connections. Can you specify which areas those structures, where those structures will be put in place? Will they be used along the Coquihalla? And can you speak to a timeline of when these structures might come together?
As I committed to yesterday, we're going to provide, I think, a Coquihalla-specific briefing to the public. Obviously, while we have people reviewing the condition of the Coquihalla right now, we've flown crews in, we've had geotechnical experts and engineers there, and continue to gather evidence on the damage and generate ideas about how we might recover the Coquihalla. We're not ready to share those just yet. We need to consider that, work with our partners in the federal government as well on a Coquihalla recovery, and we'll advise the media and the public on what our thinking is in the coming days.
Next question goes to Andrea Wu, Globe and Mail.
Hi there. For Minister Popham, from your discussions with farmers and association heads, what are the latest numerical estimates you've heard regarding the loss of poultry, hogs, cattle, and other animals as a result of the flood?
Thank you. So one of the problems is that we don't have our regular ways of tracking animals right now. We haven't been able to get access into barns to make those full assessments, but I think the BC Dairy Association has mentioned that there's probably 500 dairy cattle. I know there's thousands of poultry and I think 20,000 hogs at this time, but we're not going to be able to have those numbers probably for another week and a half. So assessment's still underway.
Andrea, do you have a follow-up?
I do. Thank you so much for that. And for Minister Farnworth, communities including Spencer's Bridge, Princeton, and Merritt have been pretty vocal in asking for more assistance with flood recovery efforts. You mentioned in your opening remarks that some of the hundreds of Canadian Armed Forces members are arriving in Princeton. What are troops currently doing, and where else can we expect them to be deployed to in coming days?
Troops are deployed to wherever they're needed, and that's determined by the experts on the ground. Right now, as I said, there are troops in Princeton, additional ones also arriving today. On Abbotsford, there are over 120 troops who are working in terms of strengthening the dikes and ensuring that the sandbagging that needs to take place is in fact happening, also being involved in logistics and moving equipment around. In terms of broader support, so communities such as Merritt, one of the obvious ones is for the people who've been evacuated, and that's why we've announced the partnership with the Red Cross in terms of the $2,000 payment to residents who have been evacuated due to the floods.
We have time for one more question. We go to Brennan Phillips, Karamias Review.
Hello, thank you for taking my question. For many communities, smaller and rural communities, they don't have the funds to handle flood mitigation work, such as First Nations communities. Will the province be providing funds going forwards for proactive flood mitigation, or will the province be moving towards, provincial government be moving towards taking more responsibility for it themselves? Thank you.
This is why we have undertaken the significant rewrite of the Emergency Program Act, because we recognize the old Act was primarily focused on response and to a certain extent recovery. It's why we're the first province in the country, along with the federal government, to sign up to the Sendai Framework and the principles around emergency management, which are based on prevention, mitigation, response, and recovery. We recognize that many communities don't have that capacity, which is also why we're currently preparing the BC flood strategy, which is part and parcel of the work along with that legislation that's in place. We have done funding for many projects, over $105 million since we took office in 2017, to have improved flood mapping and capacity building amongst First Nations. And capacity building for local communities. But we know there's a lot more that needs to be done. That's why this work has been underway, and we're going to continue doing that, and it is definitely a priority for us.
Do you have a follow-up, Brennan?
Yes, I do. Will the province then also be considering fully taking over to build a true provincial network of maintained dikes and other mitigation in order to properly secure both communities and transportation corridors where there are no or very small populations?
That's what I was just talking about in terms of the overhaul of the legislation and how we approach this, and the work that needs to be done to ensure that not just large communities, medium communities, but smaller communities and rural communities, First Nations communities, not only have the capacity in terms of ensuring that all the services are there, but the flood strategy, all that work is underway, and as I said, it is very much a priority for us.
That's all we have time for today. That concludes today's event.